Lucas Hill had always been a man of precision and passion. At 29 years old, he was known among his friends and colleagues as someone who could breathe life into any broken machine. His greatest pride, however, was the garage that stood beside his modest suburban home. More than just a space for storage, it was a sanctuary filled with tools, parts, and memories. The garage had been built by Lucas's late uncle, a man who had inspired his love for engineering and mechanics. It was here that Lucas had spent countless hours learning to disassemble and rebuild engines, perfecting his craft under his uncle's watchful eye. The garage wasn't just functional, it was personal. Every tool had its place, every surface told a story. The walls were lined with pegboards holding wrenches, ratchets, and hammers, all arranged in meticulous order. Shelves housed jars filled with bolts, screws, and washers, carefully labeled by size and type. The centerpiece of the garage was a partially restored 1969 Ford Mustang, a car Lucas's uncle had planned to fix, but never finished before his passing. Restoring it had become Lucas's life project, a way to honor the man who had given him so much. Lucas had inherited the house and garage 2 years ago, and while the mortgage was manageable, his job as an engineering consultant didn't leave him much extra money. That didn't bother him. He preferred the satisfaction of solving problems and creating solutions over material wealth. He had recently installed new shelving in the garage to organize rare Mustang parts he had managed to acquire through months of searching. Each piece represented progress, a tangible reminder of his connection to his uncle and the skills they had shared. The suburban neighborhood Lucas called home was quiet, almost idyllic. Rows of neatly kept houses lined the streets, their uniformity broken only by the occasional flourish of individual taste, a birdhouse here, a colorful garden there. The Homeowners Association, HOA, maintained strict rules about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and even the types of mailboxes allowed. Lucas didn't mind these rules. They seemed like a small price to pay for the community's safety and order. At least that's what he thought. One evening, Lucas noticed something strange as he pulled into his driveway. Small wooden stakes had been hammered into the ground near the edge of his property, each one tied with bright orange flags. He frowned, stepping out of his car to examine them. The stakes ran in a neat line, cutting through the edge of his driveway and right past his garage. They looked official, but there had been no notice or explanation. Lucas assumed it was some kind of utility work and thought little of it. The following week, an envelope appeared in his mailbox. The HOA logo was stamped in the corner, and the contents were coldly formal. The letter informed him that the association had approved a project to expand the main road running through the neighborhood. For community improvement, several properties would be partially or fully requisitioned to make room for the expansion. Lucas's garage, it seemed, was directly in the path of progress. Reading the letter, Lucas's stomach dropped. The garage wasn't just a building, it was a legacy. It wasn't something he could simply let go of. The letter stated that the HOA would hold a meeting to discuss the road project, but it was scheduled for a weekday morning, when most residents, including Lucas, would be at work. Frustrated but determined, he called the HOA office to get more information. The conversation didn't go well. The receptionist, who seemed more interested in ending the call than helping, told Lucas that the meeting had already been announced in the monthly newsletter, a document Lucas rarely read, because it was filled with mundane updates about landscaping contests and recycling schedules. When Lucas asked if there was any way to delay the project or present an appeal, the receptionist's tone turned clipped. "You'll need to take that up at the meeting," she said before hanging up. Lucas spent the next few days stewing over the situation. He considered skipping work to attend the meeting, but his current project at work was under tight deadlines, and his absence would cause problems for his team. Instead, he decided to draft a letter outlining his objections and drop it off at the HOA office before the meeting. In his letter, Lucas explained the sentimental value of the garage, the ongoing restoration project, and the fact that the proposed road expansion seemed unnecessary. He even offered to cover part of the costs to adjust the project's plans and save the garage. Days passed without a response. Then, early one Saturday morning, Lucas was jolted awake by the sound of heavy machinery. He rushed to his window and felt his heart drop. Bulldozers and construction trucks were parked in front of his house. Workers in reflective vests were hammering stakes into the ground around his garage. He threw on his clothes and sprinted outside, yelling for them to stop. One of the workers, a middle-aged man with a clipboard, looked up from his notes. "We've got orders from the HOA," he said matter-of-factly. "This garage is in the way of the expansion. It's scheduled for demolition today." Lucas's protests fell on deaf ears. The worker pointed to a laminated sheet on his clipboard, which displayed the HOA's official seal and signatures from board members. "You can file a complaint if you want, but we've got to do our job," the man said, not unkindly. Lucas felt a mix of anger and helplessness as he watched the machines roar to life. The walls of the garage, walls he had painted with his uncle so many years ago, were torn down in minutes. Tools were shoved aside, some thrown carelessly into piles, others crushed under the treads of bulldozers. The Mustang, still incomplete, was dragged out onto the driveway, its exposed frame now covered in dust and scratches. When the machines finally fell silent, Lucas stood alone in the rubble. His sanctuary was gone, reduced to a heap of broken wood and twisted metal. The workers packed up their equipment and left without so much as an apology. A new envelope was taped to his front door. It wasn't an apology or an explanation. It was an invoice from the HOA, charging him for the cost of removal and warning that late payment would incur penalties. As Lucas picked up the envelope, his hands shook with rage. This wasn't just about the garage or the Mustang anymore. This was about standing up to an organization that thought it could trample over his rights, his property, and his memories. And he wasn't going to let them get away with it. The morning after the demolition of his garage, Lucas Hill woke up to a feeling of emptiness and fury. The space that had once been his sanctuary now lay bare, a patch of churned earth marked with stray nails, broken wood, and the crushed remnants of his tools. The Mustang sat awkwardly on the driveway, its frame dented and coated in dust, a stark reminder of the violation he had suffered. Lucas stood in his kitchen, staring at the envelope the HOA had left behind the day before. It sat unopened on the counter, its mere presence enough to rekindle the anger that simmered beneath his attempts to stay calm. Finally, he tore it open. Inside was an invoice for $7,800, labeled as expenses incurred for removal of unauthorized structures. Lucas's hands tightened around the paper. The gall of the HOA was staggering. Not only had they destroyed his garage without warning or proper notice, but now they were demanding payment for the damage they had inflicted. A second document in the envelope added insult to injury, a notice informing him that any complaints about the project must be submitted in writing within 7 days. Lucas wasted no time drafting a furious letter. He outlined every injustice, the lack of proper notification, the sentimental and monetary value of the garage and its contents, and the sheer absurdity of charging him for the destruction of his property. He demanded a detailed explanation of how the HOA had the authority to proceed without his consent and requested an immediate meeting to resolve the matter. By the time he drove to the HOA office to deliver the letter, his frustration had boiled over into determination. The office was housed in a plain brick building tucked into a corner of a nearby strip mall. Lucas walked in, clutching his letter, and approached the receptionist, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s who barely glanced up from her computer. "I'm here to file a complaint," Lucas said, placing the letter on the counter. The receptionist finally looked at him, her expression one of mild irritation. Complaints can be submitted through our online portal, she said. I've already written it, Lucas replied, his tone firm. I want to speak to someone about this in person. The receptionist's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you have an appointment? No, Lucas said, his frustration mounting, but considering the circumstances, I think someone can spare a few minutes. With a sigh, the woman disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, she returned with a man in a suit, mid-50s, with a self-assured demeanor that immediately set Lucas on edge. The man extended his hand, a forced smile on his face. James Weston, he introduced himself. I'm the president of the HOA. How can I help you? Lucas didn't bother shaking his hand. You can start by explaining why my garage was torn down without my approval and why I'm being billed for it. Weston's smile barely faltered. Mr. Hill, the project has been in planning for months. Notices were sent out to all residents, and the decision was approved by the board. I didn't get any notices, Lucas shot back. They were included in the monthly newsletter, Weston said smoothly, as if that settled the matter. Newsletter? Lucas repeated incredulously. The one that's mostly about landscaping competitions and recycling schedules? That's your idea of proper notification. Weston's smile tightened. We adhere to all HOA bylaws regarding communication. If you miss the notice, I'm afraid that's on you. Lucas's frustration spilled over. This wasn't just a miscommunication. You destroyed my property, displaced my belongings, and now you're trying to charge me for it. This is theft. Weston's expression turned cold. Mr. Hill, the garage was located on land designated for public use under the revised zoning plan. The expansion of the road was necessary for the benefit of the community. Revised zoning plan? Lucas demanded. When did that happen? 2 months ago, Weston replied, his tone clipped. It was discussed and approved during a board meeting. You were welcome to attend. I wasn't even notified, Lucas said, his voice rising. And now you're telling me this was all legal? It was, Weston said, folding his hands. And I suggest you watch your tone, Mr. Hill. The HOA operates within the bounds of the law, and any further accusations on your part could be considered defamatory. Lucas stared at Weston, momentarily speechless. The arrogance, the complete disregard for his rights, it was infuriating. But more than that, it was calculated. Weston clearly believed that Lucas didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. You'll be hearing from me, Lucas said finally, his voice cold. He turned on his heel and walked out of the office, his mind racing. Over the next several days, Lucas threw himself into researching HOA bylaws, municipal zoning laws, and property rights. He combed through old files, searching for anything that might give him leverage. His uncle had been meticulous with paperwork, and Lucas eventually found a copy of the original deed to the property. The deed clearly outlined the boundaries of the land and made no mention of any public use designation. It also predated the formation of the HOA, which raised further questions about their authority to requisition his land. Lucas reached out to a local attorney, Mia Hunt, who specialized in property law. When he explained the situation, Mia agreed to take on his case. She was sharp, no nonsense, and immediately identified several potential violations in how the HOA had handled the demolition. They're banking on you not knowing your rights, Mia said during their first meeting. But based on what you've told me, they've made some serious missteps. First, the lack of proper notification. Second, the questionable zoning change. And third, their attempt to charge you for the demolition. None of this holds water if we can prove they acted outside their authority. As they worked together to build a case, Lucas started noticing other strange occurrences. A neighbor mentioned that they had seen trucks hauling away items from the garage before the demolition was completed. Lucas remembered the missing Mustang parts and wondered if some of them had been taken. When he pressed the neighbor for details, they grew nervous and refused to say more. Then, late one night, Lucas found a letter slipped under his door. It wasn't from the HOA, it was anonymous. The letter warned him to stop pursuing the matter, claiming it would only make things worse. Lucas's initial reaction was anger, but it quickly gave way to unease. He had underestimated how far the HOA, or perhaps Weston himself, might go to silence him. Despite the growing pressure, Lucas refused to back down. He and Mia filed a formal complaint against the HOA, requesting a full review of the zoning changes and demanding compensation for the loss of the garage and its contents. They also requested an injunction to halt further construction until the matter could be resolved. The HOA's response was swift and aggressive. They filed a countersuit against Lucas, accusing him of defamation and obstruction. Weston claimed that Lucas's accusations had damaged the reputation of the HOA and delayed the community's progress. The move was clearly intended to intimidate Lucas and force him to back off, but it only strengthened his resolve. As Lucas prepared for the legal battle ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that this fight was about more than just his garage. It was about standing up to a system that had grown too powerful, too comfortable exploiting those it was supposed to serve. He didn't know how long the battle would take or how much it would cost him, but he was determined to see it through. This wasn't just about justice, it was about reclaiming what was his, both physically and emotionally. Lucas Hill sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers and blueprints, trying to make sense of the chaos his life had become. Over the past week, his frustration had evolved into something sharper, something more dangerous: determination. The legal complaint against the HOA was filed, and with Mia Hunt's guidance, he was starting to piece together the framework of a solid case. But the countersuit filed by the HOA was a looming threat, a reminder that he wasn't just fighting for his garage, he was now defending his reputation and financial stability. The HOA had claimed in their countersuit that Lucas's accusations had caused irreparable damage to their reputation. According to their narrative, his unfounded allegations were delaying a crucial infrastructure project meant to benefit the community. Weston, of course, was leading the charge, appearing at small neighborhood gatherings to stoke resentment against Lucas. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes, painting Lucas as an obstructionist who cared more about his own selfish desires than the safety and progress of the neighborhood. At first, Lucas tried to ignore the smear campaign. He believed that the truth would speak for itself once the legal process began. But the whispering of neighbors grew louder, and the few casual conversations he'd once had with them became strained or outright avoided. One neighbor, a retiree named Carl who had previously been friendly, muttered under his breath when Lucas greeted him, "We don't need people like you holding us back." What made it worse was the subtle but deliberate escalation of hostility from the HOA. It started with a letter accusing Lucas of violating HOA regulations by parking his car in the street overnight, a claim Lucas knew was false, since his car hadn't left the driveway for days. Then came a notice about excessive foliage on his property, followed by another citing unauthorized modifications to his front porch, which Lucas hadn't touched since moving in. Each notice carried a small fine, which Lucas ignored, knowing they were meant to harass him. The final straw came one morning when Lucas woke to find his trash cans overturned and scattered across his lawn. His immediate thought was that it was the work of raccoons, but as he stepped outside to clean up the mess, he noticed something unusual. Among the trash was a neatly folded flyer from the HOA, with Weston's name prominently displayed, titled, "A Safer, Stronger Future for Our Community." The implication was clear: this wasn't random vandalism. Lucas brought the flyer to Mia later that day, his jaw tight with anger. "They're trying to get under my skin," he said, tossing the paper onto her desk. Mia scanned the flyer briefly before setting it aside. "It's a typical intimidation tactic," she said. "They want you to overreact. They want to paint you as irrational, unstable. Don't give them that satisfaction." "I'm not going to sit here and do nothing," Lucas replied. They're trying to turn the entire neighborhood against me." "Then we fight smarter, not harder," Mia said firmly. "Let them play dirty. We'll stick to the facts, and we'll expose them where it matters in court." Her calm demeanor helped steady Lucas, but the tension was impossible to fully shake. As the days passed, the harassment only grew more brazen. Late one night, Lucas heard footsteps outside his window. Peering out, he saw a figure retreating into the shadows, leaving behind what looked like a spray-painted message on his driveway. When he stepped outside to investigate, he found the words "Community First" scrawled in bold red letters. Lucas filed a police report the next day, but without clear evidence of who was responsible, there was little the authorities could do. The officer taking his statement seemed sympathetic but hesitant. "I've seen these HOA disputes get ugly," the officer said. "Be careful. People can do some crazy things when they feel backed into a corner." Lucas realized the officer's words could apply just as much to Weston and the HOA as they could to his own situation. It wasn't just about a road or a garage anymore, it was about power and control. Weston and the HOA wanted to make an example out of him to ensure that no one else dared challenge their authority. The tension finally boiled over during an HOA board meeting 2 weeks later. Despite his better judgment, Lucas decided to attend, hoping to get answers directly from Weston in front of the other residents. The meeting was held in the community center, a modest building with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Lucas arrived early, taking a seat near the back. As the room filled, Lucas noticed how many of his neighbors avoided making eye contact with him. Weston entered last, flanked by 2 other board members, his confident stride and polished smile radiating authority. The meeting began with routine discussions about landscaping budgets and neighborhood watch programs. But Lucas could feel the tension building as Weston approached the subject of the road expansion. "We've received some unfortunate pushback regarding this vital project," Weston said, his tone heavy with manufactured disappointment. "I want to remind everyone that this expansion isn't just about convenience, it's about safety. Wider roads mean better emergency access and safer travel for our children and families." Several neighbors nodded in agreement, but Lucas could no longer hold his tongue. He stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the room. "What about the garage you demolished without proper notification? What about the property you seized without consent?" The room fell silent. Weston's expression hardened, but he quickly regained his composure. "Mr. Hill," he said smoothly, "we've been over this. The decision was made in accordance with HOA bylaws and approved by the board. You had every opportunity to voice your concerns at our meetings." "I didn't receive any notice," Lucas shot back. "You bulldozed my property and then had the audacity to charge me for it. How is that legal?" Weston gave a patronizing smile. "I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding, but all necessary steps were followed. Perhaps you should review the bylaws more carefully before making such accusations." Lucas clenched his fists, his frustration palpable. "This isn't about bylaws. This is about you abusing your position for personal gain." Gasps rippled through the room, and Weston's face darkened. "Mr. Hill, if you continue to make baseless accusations, I will have no choice but to remove you from this meeting." "Go ahead," Lucas challenged, "but the truth will come out eventually." The standoff ended when 2 security guards stepped forward, gesturing for Lucas to leave. Reluctantly, he grabbed his jacket and walked out, his heart pounding with rage and defiance. He knew he had made himself a target, but he didn't care. As Lucas drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The battle lines were drawn, and Weston wasn't the type to back down without a fight. But neither was Lucas. He was more determined than ever to uncover the truth, no matter how far he had to go. The day after the HOA meeting, Lucas Hill sat in his living room, his Mustang model kit untouched on the coffee table, the polished metal reflecting the morning light. His mind raced as he replayed Weston's smug expression and condescending words. Each interaction with the HOA seemed to strip away another layer of patience and expose the rot beneath their facade of community leadership. Lucas had always believed in fairness, but this wasn't just a legal issue, it was personal. The garage they destroyed wasn't just a structure, it was his connection to his late uncle, the one person who had ever truly understood him. Now it was gone, and the HOA had turned his neighbors against him, making him an outcast in his own home. Lucas's phone buzzed on the coffee table, interrupting his thoughts. It was Mia Hunt, his attorney. Her sharp, no-nonsense tone was instantly grounding. "I've been going through the HOA bylaws again," she began, "and I think we've found something that could change the game." "What is it?" Lucas asked, sitting up. "It's the zoning changes they're claiming gave them the right to demolish your garage," Mia explained. "According to the bylaws, any rezoning that impacts private property has to be approved by a majority vote from residents. Did you ever receive a ballot or notice about that vote?" "No," Lucas said firmly. "I would have remembered something like that." "Then we've got a serious procedural violation on our hands," Mia said. "If they skip the vote, the entire rezoning decision might be invalid. But I'll need proof that no vote was conducted. Do you still have those newsletters they send out?" Lucas groaned. "I usually throw them away. I might have a few in my filing cabinet, but I'm not sure." "Check anyway," Mia said, "and I'll put in a formal request for their records. If we can show they didn't follow their own rules, we can challenge everything." After the call, Lucas spent hours sifting through old paperwork, cursing himself for not paying more attention to the HOA's mundane newsletters. He finally found a small stack of them tucked into a folder labeled Household. As he flipped through, he noticed something strange. There were no mentions of a zoning vote or even a road expansion in any of the newsletters from the past year. Instead, they were filled with fluff about landscaping tips and bake sales. Lucas took photos of the newsletters and sent them to Mia. By the time she called him back that evening, she sounded triumphant. "This is exactly what I needed," she said. "I've also just received some internal documents from the city's zoning office through a public records request. You're going to love this." "What did you find?" Lucas asked, his heart racing. "The rezoning request was filed by the HOA 6 months ago," Mia said. "And guess who signed it? James Weston." But here's the kicker. The request included a map of the proposed road expansion that clearly overlaps with your property. It was approved by the city, but there's no record of any resident voting on it. They bypassed the vote entirely. Lucas's jaw tightened. "So, they just decided to take my land without asking?" "It gets worse," Mia continued. "The map also includes a note about an adjacent parcel being designated for future development. That parcel isn't even part of the road project, it's part of Weston's property. He's using this whole expansion as a cover to increase his own property value." The revelation hit Lucas like a gut punch. Weston wasn't just abusing his power, he was manipulating the entire community for personal gain. Fueled by anger and a renewed sense of purpose, Lucas decided to dig deeper into Weston's connections. Late that night, while scrolling through property records and corporate filings online, he discovered something that made his stomach turn. Weston had ties to a local construction company, Clearview Developers, which had a long history of working on HOA-approved projects. In fact, Weston's brother-in-law was listed as one of the company's board members. Lucas forwarded everything he found to Mia, who immediately started piecing together a case. "This is a classic conflict of interest," she said during their next meeting. "If Weston stood to benefit financially from this project, we can argue that his actions were driven by personal gain, not community interest. And if we can prove that the rezoning vote never happened, we can bring this whole thing down." As Lucas and Mia prepared for the legal battle, the pressure from the HOA intensified. Weston continued to paint Lucas as a troublemaker in neighborhood meetings, and some residents began avoiding him altogether. One afternoon, As Lucas was working on his Mustang in the driveway, a neighbor named Heather stopped by. "I heard what happened," she said hesitantly. "I just wanted to say, I think it's wrong, what they did to your garage. But I can't say that publicly. I don't want to get on Weston's bad side." Lucas felt a pang of gratitude mixed with frustration. "Thanks, Heather, but staying quiet is exactly what Weston wants. If no one speaks up, he'll keep getting away with this." Heather hesitated, then sighed. "There's something you should know. My husband works for the city's planning department, and he mentioned that Weston had been pressuring them to fast-track the road project. I think he might have used some less than legal tactics to get it approved." Lucas's mind raced. "Do you think your husband would be willing to talk about it?" Heather shook her head quickly. "No, absolutely not. He doesn't want to get involved. I shouldn't even be telling you this." As Heather walked away, Lucas realized how deep Weston's influence ran. But he also knew that even small cracks in the facade could be enough to bring it down. The breakthrough came a week later, when Mia received a tip from a whistleblower and HOA employee who had seen enough of Weston's corruption to finally speak out. The whistleblower, a woman named Karen Foster, provided Mia with internal emails that laid everything bare. In one email, Weston explicitly instructed the board to bypass the rezoning vote, arguing that residents won't understand the long-term benefits. Another email discussed Clearview developers' involvement, with Weston reassuring the board that partnering with Clearview will ensure favorable terms for all parties, especially us. Mia called Lucas immediately. "This is it," she said. "These emails are the smoking gun. They prove Weston knew exactly what he was doing, and that it was all about lining his own pockets." Lucas felt a surge of vindication. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that justice was within reach. But he also knew the fight wasn't over. Weston wouldn't go down without a fight, and the HOA still had resources and influence on their side. As the court date approached, Lucas felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He wasn't just fighting for his garage anymore. He was fighting to expose the rot at the heart of the HOA, to show his neighbors that they didn't have to live under Weston's thumb. The night before the hearing, Lucas stood in the driveway beside his Mustang, running his hand along the scratched and dented frame. "We're not done yet," he said quietly, as if the car could hear him. It wasn't just a car, it was a promise, a reminder of everything he was fighting for. As the court hearing loomed, Lucas Hill found himself caught in a whirlwind of escalating tactics from the HOA. James Weston wasn't backing down. If anything, the pressure increased. Notices from the HOA became a near-daily occurrence, each one more absurd than the last. Lucas was accused of violating neighborhood harmony by leaving his tools visible on his driveway, and fined for not repainting his mailbox to match an updated community standard no one else seemed to have received. Even his trash collection schedule was mysteriously altered, leaving his bins untouched for weeks at a time. Lucas knew these were petty acts of intimidation, but they began to take a toll. His legal fight with the HOA consumed most of his energy, and the persistent harassment chipped away at his focus. Worst of all, it seemed as though Weston had the community on his side, or at least too scared to speak against him. The neighborhood's once friendly faces now turned away when Lucas walked past, their silence heavier than any insult. Mia Hunt, his attorney, was a steady source of reassurance. She reminded him at every turn that they were building a strong case. But even she admitted that Weston's influence was deeper than she had anticipated. "He's been running this HOA like his personal kingdom for years," she said during one late-night strategy meeting. "We're not just fighting him, we're fighting a system he's built to protect himself." Despite the mounting pressure, Lucas and Mia continued their investigation. The emails provided by Karen Foster, the whistleblower, were damning, but they needed more evidence to solidify their case. Lucas began combing through HOA meeting minutes, archived newsletters, and public records, looking for anything Weston might have overlooked. One evening, while digging through a box of old HOA documents a sympathetic neighbor had passed along, Lucas stumbled upon something that made his heart skip a beat. It was an early draft of the zoning proposal Weston had submitted to the city, marked with handwritten notes in the margins. Among the scrawled comments, Lucas recognized Weston's handwriting. Clearview gets full parcel access. Push road narrative to justify. Lucas stared at the document, his anger simmering just below the surface. This wasn't just proof of corruption, it was a deliberate, calculated plan to use the road expansion as a cover for giving Clearview developers access to private land, including Lucas's. Mia's reaction was immediate when Lucas showed her the draft. "This ties everything together," she said, her voice sharp with excitement. The road project wasn't about the community at all. It was about setting up a development deal. With this, we can argue that Weston abused his authority and violated HOA bylaws to benefit Clearview and himself. Armed with the new evidence, Lucas felt a renewed sense of purpose. But Weston wasn't about to let him gain the upper hand. The retaliation came 2 nights later. Lucas woke to the sound of voices outside his house. He crept to the window and saw 3 figures near his driveway, their shadows illuminated by the streetlights. One of them carried a can of spray paint, and Lucas watched in disbelief as they began defacing the side of his Mustang with crude symbols and the words "Community First." Rage boiled in Lucas's chest as he grabbed his phone to call the police. By the time the patrol car arrived, the vandals were gone, leaving behind only their message and the damage they had inflicted. The responding officer took down a report but seemed skeptical when Lucas suggested the attack was connected to the HOA. "It's hard to prove anything without witnesses," the officer said with a shrug. The incident only steeled Lucas's resolve. The next morning he met with Mia to discuss the escalation. She insisted on filing for a protective order against Weston and the HOA board, citing the harassment and vandalism. While the legal process was slow, Mia assured Lucas that they were building a strong foundation for a counterattack. In the meantime, Lucas decided to take matters into his own hands. With a neighbor's help, he installed security cameras around his property, determined to capture any future acts of intimidation. He also began reaching out to other homeowners in the neighborhood, trying to find allies who had suffered under Weston's rule. It wasn't easy. Most of his neighbors were either indifferent or too scared to speak out. But one evening, an older resident named Marjorie approached Lucas while he was working on the Mustang in his driveway. "I heard about what they did to your garage," she said, her voice low. "It's not right. Weston's been running this place like a tyrant for years. He's done things like this before, maybe not as blatant, but just as underhanded." Marjorie went on to describe how Weston had pressured her into paying for unnecessary repairs to her property, claiming they were required by HOA regulations. When she tried to challenge the charges, Weston threatened to fine her for other infractions. "I didn't have the energy to fight him," Marjorie admitted. "But what you're doing takes courage. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Her words were a small but meaningful victory for Lucas. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't entirely alone. As the days went on, Lucas began to piece together a clearer picture of Weston's tactics. It became evident that the HOA president used fear and manipulation to maintain control, targeting anyone who dared to challenge him. The vandalism, the fines, the smear campaigns, they were all part of a larger strategy to silence opposition. Lucas's security cameras soon provided the breakthrough he had been waiting for. Late one night, they captured footage of a man trespassing on his property, examining the Mustang and the newly installed cameras. When Lucas reviewed the footage the next morning, he recognized the man as one of Weston's close associates, someone he had seen at HOA meetings. Mia was ecstatic when she saw the footage. "This is huge," she said. If we can tie this back to Weston, it'll prove that he's not just enabling harassment, he's orchestrating it. They filed the footage as evidence in their ongoing case, adding another layer to the growing pile of accusations against Weston. But Lucas knew the battle was far from over. The HOA still had resources, and Weston's influence ran deep. The escalation reached its peak when Lucas received a cease and desist letter from Clearview developers, accusing him of defamation for spreading baseless rumors about their involvement in the road project. The letter was clearly meant to intimidate, but Lucas saw it for what it was, a sign that he was getting close to the truth. Mia assured Lucas that the letter was an empty threat, designed to scare him into backing down. "They're feeling the heat," she said. "It means we're doing something right." Despite the mounting pressure, Lucas refused to give up. He had come too far to turn back now. Every piece of evidence, every small victory brought him closer to exposing the truth about Weston and the HOA. As Lucas stood in his driveway one evening, staring at the scratched and spray-painted frame of his Mustang, he felt a surge of determination. The car had become a symbol of everything he was fighting for, not just justice for himself, but accountability for the people who thought they could abuse their power without consequence. The fight wasn't over, but Lucas was ready for whatever came next. Weston and the HOA had underestimated him, and that was their biggest mistake. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Rows of seats filled with spectators, neighbors, HOA members, and even a few reporters who had caught wind of the escalating conflict buzzed with murmurs as Lucas Hill walked in alongside Mia Hunt. The air was heavy with tension, every eye fixed on him as he took his seat at the plaintiff's table. Across the aisle sat James Weston, impeccably dressed and flanked by two sharp-dressed lawyers. His confidence radiated through the room like a challenge. Lucas felt his heart hammering in his chest, but Mia's calm, determined expression kept him grounded. "All rise," the clerk announced, and the judge entered, a middle-aged woman with an authoritative presence. As everyone settled back into their seats, the judge began reviewing the preliminary details of the case. The first few hours were tedious, with Weston's lawyers attempting to dismiss several points from Lucas's complaint. They argued that the garage demolition was within the HOA's rights, and that Lucas's allegations were baseless attacks intended to disrupt community progress. Lucas clenched his fists under the table, fighting to stay composed. Mia waited for her moment. When it came time for Lucas's team to present their case, she stood with unwavering confidence. "Your Honor, what we're dealing with here is not just a matter of property rights, but a calculated abuse of power by James Weston and the HOA. We intend to show that the road project was not only improperly approved but also used as a pretext for personal gain." The first piece of evidence Mia presented was the whistleblower emails from Karen Foster. She read aloud Weston's instructions to bypass the resident vote and use the zoning change to benefit Clearview developers. "The language here is unambiguous," Mia said, holding up a printed copy of the email. "Residents won't understand the long-term benefits. This isn't community leadership, it's manipulation." Weston's lead attorney immediately objected, claiming the emails were taken out of context. But Mia was ready. She introduced the zoning map Lucas had found, with Weston's handwritten notes outlining Clearview's access to the parcel. The courtroom grew quiet as the implications of the evidence sank in. "Your Honor," Mia continued, "this map proves that Mr. Weston's actions were not for the benefit of the community, but for the financial interests of Clearview Developers, a company with which he has personal and familial ties." She then presented documentation linking Weston's brother-in-law to Clearview's board of directors. Weston shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his polished facade cracking ever so slightly. Lucas felt a flicker of hope. But the most damning moment came when Mia called Karen Foster to the stand. Karen, a middle-aged woman with a quiet demeanor, recounted her time working for the HOA and described the pressure Weston had exerted on the board to approve the project. She detailed how dissenting voices were silenced and how Weston controlled the narrative to push his agenda. "I was afraid to speak out," Karen admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But seeing what happened to Mr. Hill was too much. I had to say something." The final blow came when Mia played the footage from Lucas's security cameras, showing Weston's associate trespassing on Lucas's property and examining the Mustang. The room erupted in murmurs, and even the judge's brow furrowed as the video played. Weston's lawyers scrambled to contain the damage, but it was clear their defense was unraveling. When Weston himself took the stand, Mia's cross-examination was relentless. She pressed him on the emails, the zoning map, and his connections to Clearview, forcing him to stumble through half-baked justifications. "Mr. Weston," Mia said, her tone icy, "can you explain why a supposed community road project required secret dealings with a development company owned by your brother-in-law?" Weston hesitated, his confidence slipping. I was acting in the best interest of the neighborhood," he stammered. "By bypassing the residents' vote?" Mia shot back. "By demolishing a private garage without proper notice? By using scare tactics to silence dissent?" The room was silent, every word hanging in the air like a dagger. Weston's lawyer quickly objected, but the damage was done. When the proceedings adjourned for the day, Lucas felt a wave of exhaustion mixed with cautious optimism. He and Mia had presented a strong case, but the final decision rested in the judge's hands. The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded as the judge delivered her verdict. Her voice was firm, her words deliberate. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the HOA, under Mr. Weston's leadership, acted improperly and in violation of its own bylaws. Furthermore, the zoning changes and demolition were conducted without the necessary resident approval, rendering them invalid. Lucas's heart soared as the judge turned her attention to Weston. "Mr. Weston, your actions demonstrate a blatant conflict of interest and abuse of power. This court orders the immediate cessation of all construction related to the road project. Additionally, the HOA is to compensate Mr. Hill for the damages to his property and legal fees." The courtroom erupted into whispers and gasps. Weston sat frozen, his face pale. Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of relief as the judge's gavel came down, signaling the end of the hearing. As Lucas walked out of the courtroom, a few neighbors approached him hesitantly. One of them, Marjorie, gave him a small smile. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing up to him, for all of us." Lucas nodded, too drained to say much, but her words stayed with him. This fight had started as a personal battle, but it had become something much larger, a fight for accountability and fairness in a system that had gone unchecked for far too long. Outside, Mia clapped Lucas on the shoulder. "You did it," she said. "We did it." Lucas looked at her, then at the bright sky above. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. But more than that, he felt pride. Not just for winning, but for standing up when it would have been easier to back down. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was a victory that mattered. And that was enough for now. In the weeks following the court victory, Lucas Hill felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The once constant tension of living under the shadow of the HOA's harassment began to fade, replaced by a tentative calm. The neighborhood that had seemed so hostile before now felt more neutral, even welcoming in small ways. A few neighbors, emboldened by Lucas's victory, started speaking up about their own grievances with James Weston and the HOA. Weston's reputation was in ruins. The court's findings of corruption and abuse of power had spread quickly, reaching even those who had been staunch supporters. The HOA board held an emergency meeting where Weston was forced to resign, his departure accompanied by murmurs of potential criminal charges. Without his domineering presence, the HOA began to shift its tone, promising transparency and reform. For Lucas, however, the fight wasn't entirely over. The compensation ordered by the court allowed him to begin rebuilding his garage, but the process was slow and bittersweet. The original structure, built with his uncle's hands and memories, could never truly be replaced. Yet Lucas approached the reconstruction with the same meticulous care he had once devoted to restoring the Mustang. The new garage was both a tribute and a fresh start. As the walls went up and the roof took shape, Lucas felt a renewed sense of purpose. He ordered new tools to replace those lost in the demolition, and each delivery felt like a small victory. The Mustang, too, began to show signs of progress. Despite the scratches and dents from its ordeal, Lucas worked tirelessly to restore its gleaming frame, determined to finish what his uncle had started. One evening, as Lucas stood in the partially finished garage, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Looks like it's coming along nicely," Marjorie said, standing at the edge of his driveway. Lucas smiled. "It's getting there. Slowly but surely." Marjorie hesitated, then added, "You know, a few of us are talking about forming a residence group, something separate from the HOA. We want to make sure nothing like this happens again. I was hoping you might consider joining us." Lucas thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that," he said. "It's about time someone kept them in check." As the weeks turned into months, Lucas's efforts bore fruit. The new garage was finally completed, a sleek and sturdy structure that honored the memory of its predecessor while offering something new. The Mustang, after countless hours of work, roared to life for the first time in decades. Lucas took it for a test drive through the neighborhood, the sound of the engine drawing smiles and cheers from those who had supported him. That evening, Lucas hosted a small gathering in his backyard. Neighbors who had once been distant now mingled freely, sharing drinks and stories. The tension that had defined the community for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of unity and possibility. As the sun set, Lucas stood by the Mustang, its polished surface reflecting the warm glow of the fading light. He thought about everything it had taken to get to this moment, the sacrifices, the setbacks, the moments of doubt. It had been a battle not just for his property but for his sense of agency, his ability to stand up against something bigger than himself. Lucas knew there would always be challenges, but for now, he allowed himself to savor the victory. The garage, the Mustang, and the newfound camaraderie with his neighbors were more than symbols of resilience. They were proof that standing your ground, no matter how daunting the odds, could make a difference. As laughter filled the air and the Mustang gleamed under the twilight sky, Lucas felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. And for the first time since the battle had begun, he felt truly at home.